Would you dare to raise your hand in a room where everyone's smarter, richer, and more powerful than you just gave up? At Harvard, where confidence echoes louder than doubt and surnames sometimes matter more than scores, that question split the air like lightning. The room was supposed to be legendary, advanced economic theory, the class that made or broke futures. That morning, the lights dimmed slightly as the projector flickered to life, and Professor Adrian Pierce, a man known for his brutal precision and zero tolerance for mediocrity, typed a single sentence on the board. Mathematically model the impact of racial inequality on U.S. economic growth over the last 50 years, accounting for social, political, and historical factors. Deadline, 72 hours. Co-authorship in the International Journal of Economic Theory. The silence was instant. No gas, no excitement, just the quiet sinking dread of students who knew they were staring at a monster. "You have 72 hours, Professor Pierce said, hands behind his back, his graying beard catching the light. No collaboration, no extensions. Impress me Preston Hale IV, born into wealth, molded by legacy, was the first to react. He scoffed, slammed his MacBook shut, and leaned back in his chair. Dad didn't spend $80,000 a year for me to write sob stories about inequality, he muttered, loud enough to be overheard. This isn't what I came to Harvard for. A few seats over, Amanda Chin, daughter of diplomats and queen of every GPA leaderboard, pursed her lips. Too risky, she whispered to the girl beside her. If I get this wrong, I lose my 4.0. Not worth the gamble. Chairs squeaked, backpacks zipped. One by one, the most elite minds in the room stood up and walked out. Not in protest, not in failure, but in refusal. Within 5 minutes, only 3 people remained. Professor Pierce, his quiet teaching assistant, Lena Morales, organizing the untouched handouts, and a young black woman sitting dead center, with a half-broken pencil clutched like a sword in her hand. Zara Ellison. She didn't come from old money, international schools, or legacy lines traced back to Harvard dormitories. She came from a one-bedroom apartment in West Baltimore, where her mother cleaned hospital floors 6 nights a week and still made dinner at dawn. Her hands were calloused from working warehouse shifts during the summer. Her textbooks were secondhand, her calculator cracked, and her backpack stitched 3 times at the strap. But her mind, that was something no one in that room had ever learned how to measure. Zara stared at the problem on the board. Where the others saw impossibility, she saw familiarity. Economic inequality over 50 years. Racial disparity as a variable. Community responses embedded in systemic shocks. This wasn't a math problem to her. It was a biography, hers. Professor Pierce? Her voice, soft but unwavering, broke the silence. The professor looked up from his desk. There was a flicker of disbelief in his eyes, like a chess master who had just been challenged by a child. Yes, Miss Ellison, she replied. I'd like to try. There was a pause, not the respectful kind, the kind that sounds like the room waiting to laugh. Pierce folded his arms. Miss Ellison, I don't mean to discourage you, but this challenge is beyond the scope of undergraduate study. It's nearly doctoral level work. With all due respect, sir, she said, you didn't mention any restrictions. You said whoever solves it gets the credit. More silence. Lena looked up briefly from her stack of papers, as if surprised someone had dared to talk back with reason. Professor Pierce exhaled. Very well, he said, tone flat, but let me be perfectly clear. No extensions, no special grading, no excuses. 72 hours. And I expect academic rigor. Zara nodded. As she began copying the variables from the board into her notebook, her fingers trembled, but not from fear, from focus. That's when she saw it. Among the matrix of econometric models, coefficients, and policy citations, one subtle term caught her eye. It was a barely visible variable, phi, with a footnote to a 1984 sociological paper on community resilience in minority neighborhoods during recession periods. It wasn't just an economic model, it was asking for a bridge between lived experience and math. And that was Zara's world. The same moment, across campus, in the private group chat Crimson Circle, A new message pinged, Preston Hale the Fourth. $50 she drops out before tomorrow's lecture. Amanda Chin. I honestly feel bad. Professor should have protected her from public humiliation. Victoria Ashford. Maybe someone should live stream it. Historic failure incoming. What they didn't know was that Zara had already seen the messages. Jason Kim, a fellow scholarship student in engineering, had discreetly added her to the group weeks ago when he noticed they were being excluded from everything. Let them talk, Jason had told her. They never expect us to listen. That's their weakness. By 10 p.m., Zara was sitting in the cold basement of the Central Library, surrounded by spreadsheets, census data, and worn-out printouts. Her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten since noon, but she didn't flinch. She ran regression after regression on decade-old Excel software. Eyes burning, fingers sore. She wasn't just modeling inequality. She was translating pain into proof. At 2 a.m., her mom called. You still up, baby? Laverne's voice was soft through the phone, already on her second overnight shift. I think I'm onto something, Zara whispered. The model, they're all missing it. They're trying to analyze from top down, but the power's from the bottom up. You remember when Miss Clara used to run soup kitchens and rent shelters from her garage? Of course, Laverne said. She fed the block when no one else would. That's resilience. That's fine. There was a long pause, then her mother chuckled. You always saw what others missed. Now just make sure they can't ignore it anymore. Zara hung up, stood and stretched. Her shoulders ached. But something deep inside her, that same fire that had gotten her into Harvard, that same fury she'd swallowed since the 8th grade when a counselor told her, maybe community college is more your lane, burned hotter. She added one last note to her working paper. They will call it innovation. I will call it survival made visible. The next morning, she walked into class. Preston was lounging in his chair like he owned the place. Amanda scrolled her phone. The professor barely looked up. Still here, Ms. Ellison? He said with a smirk. Zara nodded. Still trying, sir. She sat in the same seat, same notebook, same broken pencil. But now, she wasn't alone. Not really. She had her data, her story, her voice, and a plan. What she didn't know, and what no one else in that room could have imagined, was that by the time 72 hours ended, the name Zara Ellison would no longer be whispered in pity. It would be studied, quoted, debated, and feared. Because when the smartest gave up, she raised her hand. And what she was about to do would change Harvard forever. The news spread faster than wildfire. By the afternoon of the first day, the entire Harvard yard was buzzing with the same disbelief. The black scholarship girl actually took the challenge. In dorm rooms and coffee shops, students refreshed group chats, laughing behind glowing screens. In the private circles of legacy students, the cruelty turned organized. She's probably crying in the library already. I give her 48 hours, Max. Someone record when she gives up. It'll go viral on Crimson Threads. They laughed because they thought they were watching a slow-motion car crash. What they didn't realize was that they were watching the quiet construction of a revolution. Zara Ellison spent the first night buried in the bottom floor of the Central Library, surrounded by maps of post-industrial cities, hand-annotated census tracts, and journals even Professor Pierce had probably forgotten existed. Her eyes were bloodshot, her hands cramped. But her mind was sprinting. She had found it, the invisible thread. The footnote no one else even noticed. Phi, the community resilience coefficient, was more than an obscure reference. It was a buried doorway. Traditional economic models accounted for capital investment, labor distribution, policy shifts, but they missed what her community had known for generations. You cannot quantify a system while ignoring the people who've lived through its worst parts. Zara began to sketch a new model, one that included metrics for mutual aid networks, grassroots organizing, unofficial childcare economies, street-level medical exchange systems, and food distribution resilience in food deserts. She began mapping the data backward to the crack epidemic, the foreclosure crisis, redlining, even to the GY Bill's racial discrepancies. Every chart was a memory. Every number had a face. She remembered Mrs. Nadine, who babysat for free on Fridays so working moms could rest. She remembered how her mom used grocery store rewards points like a military strategy. She remembered her neighborhood's group chat that activated faster than 911 during the COVID waves. Harvard called it informal infrastructure. Zara called it home. That morning, as the sky turned pale gray and the dining halls unlocked their doors, Zara sat alone with a breakfast sandwich she couldn't afford but needed to function. Her phone buzzed. It was her mother. "You alive?" the voice asked, somewhere between humor and concern. "Barely," Zara replied, "but I think I'm close. I just need, I don't know, proof that I'm not crazy for trying to do this my way." There was a pause on the line. Then came her mother's voice, gentle but rooted in steel. "Baby, you're not crazy. You're finally putting numbers to what we've all been living. And when they realize that, when they see that your data came from pain they never had to feel, that's when they'll understand brilliance isn't born in privilege. It's forged in survival." Zara didn't respond. She couldn't. Her throat was tight. Later that afternoon, Professor Pierce began the lecture with his usual controlled tone. "Ms. Ellison," he said with a faint smirk, "I assume you're still pursuing the problem?" Zara nodded silently. "You do understand," he added, turning to the class, now watching with popcorn-ready fascination, "that this problem wasn't meant to be solved with emotion or lived experience. We're not writing poetry, we're doing economics." Some students laughed. Zara said nothing. She didn't flinch. But inside, something snapped. Not in anger, in clarity. If they were going to ridicule her lived reality, she would weaponize it. That night, while most of the campus prepared for another party, this time jokingly dubbed Zara's Goodbye Gala, she stayed behind in the computer lab, building her model with the quiet rage of someone who had been counted out too many times to care what people thought anymore. But she wasn't alone. Jason Kim, the Korean-American engineering student who had given her access to the elite group chats, brought her coffee and sat beside her without speaking. He simply watched her code, watched her model, watched her quietly make the loudest academic statement Harvard had seen in years. "These people think data is neutral," Jason finally said, "but they never realize who gets to decide what's relevant in the first place." Zara turned to him. "I'm going to show them that survival is science." By hour 36, Zara had integrated over 50 independent variables into a dynamic equation that could simulate economic resilience based on historical trauma and social capital density. Her model could account for the ways neighborhoods recover, resist, or collapse, not just from money, but from trust, from shared grief, from culture. It wasn't just economics, it was anthropology, sociology, and systems theory braided together. It was messy, it was hard to quantify, and it was true. She reached out to a handful of local nonprofits from her old Baltimore neighborhood, requesting anonymous community survey data they had collected for grant applications. 3 of them responded within 6 hours. She wept when she opened the files, because the numbers matched her model almost exactly. They had survived, not because of government policy, but because they had each other. And now, she had the numbers to prove it. That night, Zara received one more message. "Jason Kim, you won't believe this. One of the donors overheard Pierce mocking you at a dinner, called you a statistical outlier playing in waters too deep." Zara sat still. It wasn't the insult that stung. It was the familiarity of it, the way it echoed every guidance counselor, every school administrator, every fake smile that came with the words, "Just be realistic." She opened a new slide in her presentation. At the top she wrote, "If I am an outlier, then perhaps it's the systems model that's broken." By hour 60, something incredible happened. A professor from the sociology department, Dr. Marquez, knocked softly on her Carol wall in the library. "I heard you're working on the Pierce problem," he said gently. "Mind if I take a look?" He was an immigrant son himself, one of the few on campus who had climbed the same ladder with splinters in his hands. Zara turned her laptop and held her breath. He read and kept reading, and at one point whispered under his breath, "My God, this isn't a solution. It's a redefinition. He sat down beside her, eyes wide. You're not just solving the problem. You're changing the question. Do you know how rare that is? Zara stared at him. I wasn't trying to. I just didn't know how to do it their way. He smiled. Exactly. That's why it works. With less than 12 hours left, Zara rehearsed her presentation. Not to perfect her delivery, but to make sure every slide told a story. Not of theory, but of truth. Because tomorrow morning she wasn't just going to show up. She was going to walk into that room, click her laptop, and hold up a mirror. To the students, to the professor, to Harvard itself. And the only thing more dangerous than a girl who knows she's underestimated is a girl who's finally ready to show them why they were wrong. The room was packed, not just with students from advanced economic theory, but with curious professors from other departments, a few graduate students who heard whispers about the scholarship girl's impossible solution, and even a vice provost sitting incognito in the back row. There was a tension in the air, like the seconds before a thunderstorm hits. Most expected a public meltdown, a brave but foolish student finally collapsing under the weight of her own ambition. And in the front row sat Preston Hale IV, scrolling his phone, smirking. Get your popcorn. She's about to break, he messaged to the Crimson Circle chat. She probably spent 72 hours crying into a spreadsheet, added Victoria Ashford. Honestly, this is why we don't give out scholarships like candy, Amanda Chin posted. Professor Adrian Pierce entered the room with a look of grim satisfaction, the kind professors wear when they're about to deliver a hard but necessary lesson. He folded his arms and gave a single nod toward the podium. Miss Ellison, the floor is yours. Let's hope this wasn't a complete waste of everyone's time. Zara stood up, no trembling hands, no stuttering steps. Just quiet resolve. She plugged in her laptop. The screen lit up, and for the first time all semester, the room went silent. The first slide wasn't a graph. It wasn't an equation. It was a quote. The place in which I'll fit will not exist until I make it. James Baldwin. Then the math began, but not like they expected. Zara's model wasn't just complex, it was alive. It breathed data, it pulsed with humanity. It connected dots the class had never thought to draw lines between. Her methodology was unlike anything they'd seen, a hybrid of economic modeling, behavioral analysis, and lived community data. As she spoke, her voice was calm, unapologetic, fierce. While others saw community instability as a symptom, she said, my model treats it as a response, an ecosystem of survival built over generations of exclusion. Slide by slide, she peeled back the layers. She showed how neighborhoods considered economically irrelevant by traditional models were actually hotbeds of adaptation. How mutual aid, underground childcare economies, barbershop activism, and informal job-sharing networks had sustained entire communities through crises that Wall Street didn't even feel. She backed it all with numbers. Her own algorithm, regression models, time series analysis, community-sourced resilience indices, social capital density visualizations. It wasn't just math anymore. It was proof. Pierce's smug expression cracked. Preston's hand froze over his keyboard, and Amanda's mouth slowly parted in the stunned silence. But Zara wasn't done. She clicked to the final slide. Primary data source, the Harvard Elite WhatsApp group. Murmurs exploded through the room. She turned to Jason Kim, who stood from the side of the room and connected his laptop. A real-time feed of the private group chat appeared on the projector. Screenshots from the past 72 hours. $50 she doesn't even show up. This is almost cruel to watch. Affirmative action at its worst. The room froze. Zara took a breath. I use this behavior as a variable to measure the inverse relationship between privilege and risk perception. You all gave me real-time data on how fear of discomfort influences academic risk-taking. She clicked again. A scatter plot appeared. It showed names, performance scores, and a stunning trend line. The more privileged the background, the less likely a student had attempted any risky or socially critical academic work. You weren't just spectators, she said. You were participants in a live study on how institutional bias protects underperformance. A voice from the back broke the silence. Miss Ellison, It was Professor Marquez from sociology. He stood slowly, eyes shining. This is, without exaggeration, one of the most innovative approaches to economic modeling I've seen in my career. But before anyone else could speak, Pierce stepped forward, flustered. This is highly inappropriate. She's using private conversations. There are ethics. Are there? Interrupted Professor Wright, who had quietly entered through the side door. He was holding a folder. Because I seem to recall, Professor Pierce, that you yourself referred to Miss Ellison at a donor event as a statistical outlier playing in waters too deep. Is that correct? The room gasped. Pierce turned white. That's hearsay, he began. I have the audio, said Wright, holding up a small recorder, and a signed statement from a donor who was appalled. Then he opened the folder. Additionally, I submitted Zara's model to the Journal of Economic Behavior and the American Economic Review under review. Both have expressed strong interest, not because she met expectations, but because she shattered the foundation those expectations were built on. Pierce tried to speak, but no sound came. Zara turned back to the room. She looked directly at Preston. Preston, since you grew up, quote, listening to economic theory at the dinner table, would you care to comment on the methodological implications of my intersectional resilience coefficient? Preston opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing. Zara smiled gently. No worries. Sometimes recognizing genius requires stepping outside your own echo chamber. Applause erupted. Not polite, not obligatory, real, raw. And for the first time, Zara felt it not as validation, but as justice. Pierce was quietly escorted out of the room by two administrators. Professor Wright approached Zara. Miss Ellison, he said, the dean would like a word. Privately, she nodded. As the room emptied, Amanda Chin lingered. She approached with visible shame. I didn't see it, she said. I didn't want to. Zara didn't glare. She didn't gloat. She just said, now you do. Later that day, the dean announced a full investigation into Professor Pierce's conduct. He was suspended indefinitely. But that wasn't all. Zara was offered a full research grant, a mentorship under Professor Wright, and immediate fast-track publication of her model. 6 months later, the Ellison framework was being studied in graduate schools across the country. Applications to Harvard from underrepresented communities rose 300%. Zara's story, it became legend. At graduation, she delivered the student address. Her mother, Laverne, sat in the front row in her best church dress, crying, laughing, proud beyond words. Zara ended her speech with the line, they said I didn't belong in that room, but sometimes you have to raise your hand not because you're ready, but because you're right. As the crowd stood in ovation, far in the back of the stadium, a janitor pushing a broom paused. It was Adrian Pierce, stripped of tenure, blacklisted from academia, now working part-time maintenance to make ends meet. He watched the girl he tried to silence redefine the very system that made him powerful. She saw him, but said nothing. Because the best revenge is not humiliation. It's building something so powerful that their existence becomes irrelevant. And that's exactly what she did.